Howard Hughes' private life was far from glamorous. Jars of urine, years of addiction, and bizarre eating habits took their toll. But this horrific lifestyle could only be matched by his terrible, jaw-dropping death. A multifaceted, outgoing, and ceaselessly creative person, Howard Hughes did it all. From becoming a pilot, to an aerospace engineer, a businessman, a filmmaker, and even a philanthropist. It seemed like there was nothing Howard Hughes couldn't do. And then he slowly started to become unhinged, showing increasingly bizarre behavior. Hughes came from a family with deep roots in American mythology. On his mother's side, there was the man who baptized George Washington. Hughes' cousins were the Wright brothers, and his uncle was the Oscar-nominated novelist, screenwriter, and film director, Rupert Hughes. His birth certificate states that Howard Hughes was born on Christmas Eve 1905 in Harris County, Texas. But then there's his baptism certificate that says he was born on September 24, 1905, and gives no place of birth at all. Wherever and whenever Hughes was born, we do know that he was an exceptional young man. When he was just 11 years old, he built Houston's first wireless radio transmitter and became the first licensed ham radio operator in the state. The next year, he appeared in the newspaper as the first boy in Houston to have a motorized bicycle, which he built himself. By the time he was 14, he'd already taken his first flying lesson. In 1922, his mother died due to complications from pregnancy, and 2 years later, his father died from a heart attack. Suddenly, at the age of 17, Hughes had become an orphan. His parents had gone so suddenly that his father hadn't updated his will, and this would change Hughes' life forever. It's likely that his dad wouldn't have wanted to leave his entire unfettered estate to his young son, but that's exactly what happened. At 19 years of age, Hughes became an emancipated minor, which granted him access to the vast sum of money he'd inherited as the sole child of rich parents. The first thing he did was quit school and marry his sweetheart, Ella Rice. Hughes and his young wife went off to Los Angeles with a fortune to spend. Hughes soon met Ralph Graves at LA's Wilshire Country Club. Graves was an actor, and he had a business opportunity for Hughes. He'd written a film script, and he knew the perfect actor to star in it himself. All he needed was the money to make it. Hughes had an interest in movie making, so he handed over $40,000 to make the film. With no experience in filmmaking, he was jumping in at the deep end. The movie Graves got Hughes to finance was called Swell Hogan, but what actually swelled was the budget. It doubled to $80,000. Then, when Hughes saw the finished product, he thought it wasn't good at all. He took the movie to his Uncle Robert, who was in the industry, and asked his opinion. Robert Hughes thought the movie was so terrible that he told his nephew to burn the only existing copy of it, or else he would be the laughingstock of Hollywood. We'll never know how bad it actually was, because Hughes took his uncle's advice and destroyed the only copy. His first try at filmmaking had been a disaster, but he wasn't a quitter. Hughes' wife had divorced him and returned to Houston, so he decided it was a good time to date famous beauties. He had romantic connections with Bette Davis, Olivia de Havilland, Ginger Rogers, and Katharine Hepburn. And if you believe the rumors, a few male beauties like Cary Grant and Tyrone Power as well. Hughes was so happy with his life in the movies that he decided it was time to make a huge purchase. He saw that RKO Pictures was struggling and decided to buy them out. He quickly fired 700 workers and reduced the studio's output from 30 films a year to just 12. If the employees remaining at RKO thought they were lucky, they were in for another surprise. Hughes' next act was to completely shut down RKO, because he had suspicions that some of the employees may be communists. For 6 months, he investigated the background of every employee to be sure that they all had anti-communist political ideologies like his own. In some people's opinions, Hughes was acting like a madman. Now he was going to have to explain himself. The minority shareholders of RKO were not at all impressed with Hughes' behavior, so they started suing him left, right, and center. Hughes had an easy solution. He simply bought their shares and became the sole owner of RKO. Hughes sold RKO 6 months later and laughed all the way to the bank. He made so much money from the sale that he could now get on with his next venture. He purchased 1,200 acres of land in Culver City and over 4,000 acres in Tucson, Arizona. Next, he bought 25,000 acres near Las Vegas. Clearly, the man had a plan, but one careless mistake had the potential to derail everything. In 1936, Hughes was driving through the streets of L.A. when he hit a pedestrian named Gabriel W. Meyer with his car. Meyer was killed in the incident, and when a doctor examined Hughes, he noted that the millionaire had been drinking. A witness said that Hughes' driving was erratic, and Meyer had been safely within a streetcar stop when he was hit. Hughes was thrown in prison overnight, and it seemed like he would be charged with homicidal negligence. Miraculously, the witness suddenly changed his story, and Hughes walked away scot-free. The whole thing seemed suspicious, but Hughes shook it off and started on his new obsession, breaking a world record. In 1933, Wiley Post flew around the world in 186 hours, and Hughes set his sights on beating that record. But he had an ulterior motive. He wanted the world to know that long-distance air travel was safe. On July 14, 1938, he and his crew landed in New York, beating Post's record by an astonishing 95 hours. The eccentric Howard Hughes was getting more and more notorious by the day. In the 1940s, Hughes dated Hollywood actor Jean Peters and eventually proposed. But Peters said no because she was focusing on her career. Or maybe she noticed that Hughes was having his security men follow her every step. Years later, the couple reconnected, and this time Peters was ready to be his wife. In 1957, they tied the knot in a hotel in Nevada. In 1958, Hughes decided he wanted to binge-watch some movies. That might not sound too unusual, except Hughes' idea of binge-watching meant watching in a private studio for 4 full months. He didn't leave the studio in that time, and only consumed chicken, chocolate, and milk. Hughes had spent 4 months watching movies in the dark. When he came out of the studio, he hadn't taken a bath, cut his hair, or even clipped his finger and toenails. Then he did it all over again. This time, when Hughes wanted to binge-watch movies, he chose a more comfortable place, a bungalow at the rather expensive Beverly Hills Hotel. Hughes sat around his bungalow watching movies, and only wearing a pink hotel napkin to cover his private parts. In that single year, he spent something close to $11 million at the hotel. Of course, the million-dollar question was, what the hell was he watching all that time? One film he liked to watch was Ice Station Zebra, a spy thriller starring Rock Hudson. Hughes owned a TV station, and he simply demanded that they play the film over and over again. They ran it over 100 times. If Hughes fell asleep and missed a part, he'd just call them up and have them replay it. Watching movies for months on end was weird and concerning, but mostly harmless. Soon, though, Hughes would be in the center of a huge presidential scandal. Most people know about the Watergate scandal involving then-President Richard Nixon, but not everyone knows about Hughes' involvement. Nixon, a Republican, had heard that the Democrats had information about some shady dealings he had had with Hughes, including a $200,000 bribe. He sent his men into the Watergate Hotel to steal info that incriminated him. As it turned out, there was no info, the men were caught, and Nixon lost his presidency. By the late 1960s, Hughes was moving from one hotel to another with his collection of aides and girlfriends. In November of 1966, Hughes and his entourage took a train to Las Vegas and went directly to the Desert Inn. Hughes wanted to stay for a long time, and to avoid any problems from the staff or the owners, he simply bought the place. There was a major annoyance in the bedroom he chose at the Desert Inn. The bright lights on the sign at the Silver Slipper Casino kept him awake. He could have changed rooms, but instead he bought the Silver Slipper and had the sign moved. What a lad! As Hughes got older, his behavior got more and more eccentric. For example, he always had the same thing for dinner: a medium rare steak, salad, and peas. But only small peas. Breakfast had to be eggs made the way the family cook had made them when he was a child. In 1970, Hughes realized he'd lost touch with his wife. Really, they didn't live together and only communicated by telephone. Well, Jean didn't think this was much of a marriage, so she asked for a divorce. This looked like it would be the courtroom drama of the century, filled with exposed secrets and bitter fighting over money. The media was ready to publish every scandalous detail. Well, that didn't happen. As it turned out, all Peters wanted from Hughes was $70,000 a year. She never talked about Hughes after their divorce, even though there was no confidentiality agreement. And Hughes never said an unkind word about her. The lack of drama around his divorce was a disappointment to gossip lovers. Sometime around the beginning of April 1976, Hughes boarded his Learjet in Acapulco, Mexico, and headed to Houston. Then disaster struck. At some point during the flight, Hughes stopped breathing. When the plane arrived at the hospital in Houston, the doctors couldn't believe their eyes. They had to identify Hughes' body, but they couldn't. His reclusive lifestyle and alleged drug use had altered his appearance. He weighed less than 100 pounds and had long fingernails, toenails, beard, and hair. He was also using an alias, John T. Cooper. The doctors in Houston finally came up with fingerprints as a way to identify Hughes' body. The next thing to do was figure out what had happened to him. The autopsy result was that kidney failure was the cause of his demise. But like most things with Hughes, there was more controversy and mystery. An investigation into Hughes' passing revealed that he'd received a lethal injection. They also did an X-ray and found 5 pieces from hypodermic needles in his arms. In addition to this, Hughes had bed sores and suffered from malnutrition. Surprisingly, they ruled out foul play. Apparently, he'd done this all to himself. With that cleared up, the next thing on everyone's mind was who would get his money. Of course, like everything else in Hughes' life, there was intrigue. No one could find Hughes' will, and then suddenly, one turned up. It was handwritten, and they found it in Salt Lake City, Utah. Strangely, it was sitting on a desk at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They called it the Mormon Will, and no one knew where it came from and why it was on that desk. And then a man stepped forward. It turned out that a mysterious man had delivered the will to a gas station owned by Melvin Dumar. Dumar said that previous to this, he had helped a man who was lying on the side of the highway near Las Vegas. The man later told Dumar that he was Howard Hughes. The will left money to many different organizations, and lawyers couldn't help but notice that Dumar was also a recipient. Someone smelled a rat and started investigating this mysterious will. A Nevada jury deliberated and decided that someone had forged the Mormon Will, and it was not at all valid. Dumar didn't get any of his inheritance, but he also didn't land up in prison. Because there was no will, Hughes' enormous estate got split into 22 equal parts, one for each of his cousins. Hughes' personal appearances in pop culture are too numerous to mention, but his reclusive persona also inspired some iconic characters that people might not realize. Stan Lee used Hughes' life as an inspiration for Tony Stark in Iron Man. Albert R. Broccoli, producer of the James Bond series, copied Hughes' life for an eccentric character in Diamonds Are Forever. Hughes was so grateful to Broccoli that he kept a copy of the film in his private collection. In the aftermath of the death of Howard Hughes, there was one last mystery still out there. People wanted to know what had made Hughes act so unhinged. Most people just assumed that Hughes was crazy because of his money, but there may have been a sad and scandalous answer. It was his own fault. As a young man, the incorrigible Hughes contracted syphilis at the height of his womanizing era. When the bacteria spreads to the brain, it can cause a host of symptoms called neurosyphilis. Doctors diagnosed Hughes with neurosyphilis in the early 30s, and it's even worse than it sounds. Neurosyphilis causes widespread damage to the brain, which can have a range of effects, including psychosis, dementia, depression, delirium, and more. And it gets worse. Hughes got the disease before the discovery of antibiotics, so doctors at first treated him with mercury, which has its own host of side effects. Add that to what was likely undiagnosed OCD, and it's little wonder that his mental state deteriorated as badly as it did. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.